The man across the table breathed through his nose when his cards were good and through his mouth when they were not. He had been doing it for 3 hours. Nobody else noticed because nobody else was looking for it. I was looking for it from the first hand because reading people across a card table was the only thing I had ever been good at in this life and in the last one. My name is Ray Crow. I am 16 years old. In my previous life I was also Ray Crow, also a poker player, and significantly harder to kill than whoever shot me apparently expected. I came back with every memory intact, every tell I had catalogued, every pattern I had mapped, every hour of the 20 years I spent turning the ability to read people into the largest private gambling operation in the world. I came back as an infant in a hospital room, which was an indignity I have chosen not to dwell on, and I spent the first 4 years learning to walk and talk again before I could begin doing anything useful with what I remembered. Now I was 16 and sitting at a 10,000 buy-in table in the basement of a dry cleaning business in the warehouse district, and the man breathing through his mouth was the owner of this basement and 2 others, and he had just called my raise with a hand he should have folded 20 minutes ago. I turned over 2 pair. His straight was 1 card short. The pot crossed the table to my side and I stacked the chips without hurrying because hurrying looked like relief and I had not been relieved. I had been certain. Those were different things and experienced players could tell them apart. His name was Vargas. Above his left shoulder, in the space where I had been seeing things since I was 4 years old, floated a 9 of spades. Not physically, nobody else could see it. I had established this by the time I was 6 through a series of tests that mostly involved asking adults what they saw above other people's heads and recording their confusion. The cards existed in my perception only. What they meant had taken me 12 years to map with enough precision to be useful. Numbered cards were lives on their own trajectory, predictable, bounded, running toward a fixed horizon. Face cards were lives that bent other lives, people who became leverage points in larger events. Aces were genuinely unpredictable, the cards shifting constantly, and 3 times I had been near an ace when it changed and each time the world had moved in a direction nobody had anticipated. A 9 of spades meant subtraction within 2 to 3 years. Not death necessarily, spades meant loss, removal, the end of something that had been central. What specifically I could not say. The card gave category and timing. Inference filled the rest. What it told me tonight was that Vargas was a man operating near the end of a particular kind of luck, and men near the end of their luck play to protect rather than to win, and protection at a poker table looked like exactly what he had been doing for 3 hours, calling when the correct move was fold, holding positions that were already lost because releasing them felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. I had come to this club 8 months into my current strategy. The strategy was simple and I had run a version of it before: start at the bottom of the district's informal poker economy, win consistently enough to move up, and do not stop moving until the map was complete. The map currently had 14 points on it. I had one at 12. The 2 I had not played were the 2 where the cards above the house operators had indicated unfavorable variance, and I had learned in the previous life that variance killed careful players faster than bad judgment did because bad judgment was correctable and variance was not. Tonight was the 14th point. Vargas was the 12th win. He called my last raise with a pair of queens and I showed 3 sevens and the table went quiet in the specific way tables went quiet when a large pot moved and everyone was recalculating their own position relative to the new information. I stacked the final chips. $14,300. I had walked in with $600. At the cash-out window Vargas was waiting. 2 men stood slightly behind him with the positioning of people placed there to be noticed. He said the house took 15% on main table winnings. This rule had not existed when I sat down and we both knew it. I said the board behind the window said 10% and that enforcing an invented rule on a 16-year-old in a basement where nobody would call the police was the kind of decision that followed a person, and I asked him whether 14,000 was worth the version of tonight that came after I chose not to agree to it. He looked at me for a moment. The 9 of spades pulsed faintly the way I had noticed face cards and high-numbered cards pulsed in moments of genuine decision, as if the card registered the weight of what was being chosen. He stepped aside. I went up the stairs. The warehouse district was cold and quiet at this hour. I had arrived on a bicycle, which I had learned in the previous life was better camouflage than a car at locations where you did not want to be remembered. I put the cash in the frame bag and started pedaling home and thought about the map and the 14 points and what came next. What came next was the name that had appeared in sideways conversations across 6 different clubs over 8 months, the person at the top of the district's informal poker economy, the one whose name other operators referenced with the particular careful neutrality of people talking about something they respected and did not want to antagonize. I had never seen them. I had heard enough to know the card above them was a king of spades. I had seen 3 kings in 12 years of cataloging. All 3 had been people in the process of changing something large. A king of spades specifically I had no data on. It was the only card in my system that remained uncharacterized. I was going to have to sit across from it and find out what it meant. Home was a 20-minute ride. The apartment was quiet, my parents asleep, the kitchen light on the way my mother always left it. I put the cash in the flour container where I kept the accumulation, $60,000 now, give or take, and went to check on my sister the way I always did when I came in late. Her door was half open. She was asleep with one arm off the edge of the bed, the same way she had slept since she was small. Above her right shoulder the card was a 7 of hearts. Warm, steady, the quality of light that 7s carried, not dramatic, not world-changing, just continuous. A life that kept going in the direction it was already going. I watched it for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I went to my room and lay on my bed with my jacket still on and looked at the ceiling and thought about the king of spades and about $60,000 and about how long 2 years was when you had already lived one life and knew exactly how fast the good parts ended. The black card came the way it always came when I was close to sleep, not above anyone's shoulder, not in the peripheral space where the fate cards lived, but directly in front of me, filling the field of vision completely. No suit. No number. Black on both sides and giving off no light, taking in the light around it instead. I had reached for it the moment before I died and I had been reaching for it in the space behind my eyes every night since. I still did not know what it was. I knew it was not a fate card. I knew it was not above anyone I had ever met. I knew it had been present at my death and that its presence had not been coincidental and that somewhere between the basement I had just walked out of and whatever the king of spades turned out to be, the answer to what it was waiting. My sister knocked on my door at 7 and asked if I wanted coffee and I said yes and listened to her move around the kitchen and watched the 7 of hearts glow steady in my memory of the doorway. 2 years was too slow. I got up, the king of spades had a name. It was Felix Hahn. He was 31 years old, and he owned controlling interests in 4 legitimate poker clubs, a sports betting platform, and a private members room in the financial district where the minimum buy-in was $50,000 and the guest list had never been published anywhere. I had spent 3 weeks building this picture from fragments, the careful sideways references in 6 different clubs, a business registration I had found in a public database, 2 conversations I had engineered by positioning myself near people who knew him. The picture was detailed enough to act on and I had been waiting for the specific moment when acting on it made sense rather than acting on it because I was impatient, which was the mistake I had made twice in the previous life before I learned that timing was not the same thing as hesitation. The moment arrived on a Thursday when a player named Cho who operated 2 tables in the Northern District lost his primary club in a single session to a man I had not seen before, a heavy player, mid-40s, who had come in with $100,000 and left with everything Cho owned including the lease. I heard about this on Friday morning from 3 separate sources, which meant it was circulating fast, which meant it was significant in a way that ordinary losses were not. By Friday afternoon I had identified the heavy player as a man called Rice who ran acquisition for Felix Hahn's operation. Hahn had just expanded north. The district was reorganizing around a new center of gravity and reorganization was the condition under which approach was possible without appearing to be either threat or supplication. I sent a message through the only channel that made sense, the bartender at the club nearest Hahn's financial district room, a man who I had tipped consistently for 4 months and who I had watched receive and pass messages for half a dozen people with the professional invisibility of someone who understood that information movement was its own economy. The message was 4 words, Ray Crow wants in. I did not explain what I meant by in because the message was not for understanding. It was for noticing. A name with no context attached to it was more interesting than a name with an explanation, and interesting was the first door. The response came back in 48 hours, Sunday, 11 p.m., the financial district address, bring your buy-in. Sunday at 11 the room was smaller than I expected and more expensive looking than anything I had sat in since the previous life. 8 players around a single table, a dealer who moved with the precision of someone paid specifically for precision, lighting designed to be comfortable rather than dramatic. 7 of the 8 players had cards above them that I scanned in the first 30 seconds, 2 tens, a jack of diamonds, a 4, 2 eights, a 3. Normal distribution. Lies at various scales doing what lives did. Felix's hand sat directly across from me, and above his right shoulder the king of spades was the largest card I had ever seen in 12 years of seeing them. Not physically larger, dimensionally larger, occupying more of the perceptual space, as if the card was not just categorizing his fate but actively shaping the space around it. I had never seen a card do that before. I kept my face at the same temperature it was always at in the first minutes of a new table, and I filed what I was seeing and I looked at his hands instead. His hands were the first problem. In the previous life I had sat across from 11 world-class players and I had read all of them within 90 minutes, found the tell, mapped the pattern, built the model that made the outcome predictable. Felix's hand had been playing for 40 minutes and I had nothing. Not a partial tell. Not a tendency. Not even the negative data of a suppressed tell, which was itself a tell. His hands were still in the specific way that genuine stillness was still, not performed stillness, not the careful non-movement of someone who had trained themselves to eliminate signals. He was simply not producing signals. I had encountered this once before in the previous life, a player from Macau who had taken me 4 hours to crack, and the memory of those 4 hours was not comfortable. I played conservatively for the first hour. This was unusual for me and I knew it would be noticed, and I wanted it to be noticed because conservative early play from someone who had sent a forward message requesting entry communicated that I was here to observe before I was here to act, which was true, and communicating true things at a poker table was always more disorienting to the opposition than communicating false ones. Han won 3 hands in the first hour without showing me anything. The third hand he won on a bluff. I identified it as a bluff because the pot odds did not justify the call that the other player made, which meant Han had communicated something across the table that was not in his hands and not in his face and not in the standard physical inventory I was running. He had won with a mechanism I could not locate. This was the second problem, larger than the first. At the 90-minute mark I changed approach. Instead of reading him I started reading the table's response to him, how the other players adjusted their behavior in hands where he was active versus hands where he folded early. The adjustment was consistent and significant. 3 of the 7 other players tightened their ranges measurably when Han was in a hand, a degree of behavioral change that indicated not just respect but something closer to established pattern. They had played with him before and they had learned something from it, and the learning had made them smaller at the table, not larger. That was information. Fear produced smaller players, and Han had produced fear in people who were themselves not small. I played my first aggressive hand at the 2-hour mark. Not against Han, against the jack of diamonds 2 seats to his left, a player who had been bleeding chips slowly for 90 minutes and who I had mapped thoroughly in the time I had spent not mapping Han. I took the pot cleanly, and it was not a large pot, and the point was not the pot. The point was that Han looked at me when the chips moved and I looked back, and neither of us looked away immediately, and in that 4 seconds of direct eye contact I got the first data point I had been waiting for. His eyes moved to my chip stack before they moved back to his own. Not greed, calculation. He was updating his model of me the same way I was updating my model of him, and he wanted me to know he was doing it. That was a tell. Small, possibly deliberate, but a tell. A man who showed you he was calculating you was a man who believed the showing had strategic value, which meant he was playing a longer game than the current hand, which meant the current hand was not where the real game was happening. I looked at the king of spades above his shoulder, and it pulsed in the way high cards pulsed at moments of genuine decision, and I thought, he knows something about me. Not from tonight. From before tonight. The hand that mattered came at the 3-hour mark. I had built my stack to 40,000 from the original 50,000 buy-in, a modest gain that communicated patience rather than aggression, and Han had built his to roughly double his starting position through a series of medium pots won with a consistency that was either extraordinary luck or extraordinarily controlled play. We were the 2 largest stacks at the table. The other players had the quality of people who understood they were now peripheral to whatever was happening in the center of the room. He raised preflop from early position. I had a hand I would have played differently against anyone else, pair of kings, strong, the kind of hand that invited aggression. Against Han I flat called instead of re-raising because re-raising told him the strength of my hand and I was not ready to tell him anything yet. The other players folded. The flop came 9, 3, jack in mixed suits. He checked. I checked. The turn was a king. I had 3 kings and he checked again and I checked again, and the table had the specific quality of silence that gathered around hands where both players were certain they were winning. The river was a 9. He bet 2/3 of the pot. I raised. He went all in. I called. He turned over pocket 9s. A full house, 9s over kings. I turned over 3 kings. We looked at each other across the table over the chips for a long moment. I had lost the hand and the hand had cost me $40,000, and the loss did not touch me because the hand was not about the money. He had slow played a monster and so had I, and we had met in the middle of the hand like 2 people who had been walking toward each other from opposite ends of a long room and had finally run out of room. He said, "You checked the turn." I said, "So did you." He said, "I was trapping." I said, "I know." He said, "Why did you check?" I said, "Same reason." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have been rotating through the district for 8 months. I said, 9. He said, 12 clubs. I said, 14. He said, "You sent me 4 words and expected me to know what they meant." I said, "You knew what they meant." He said, "Yes." He looked at his chips, my former chips, being stacked by the dealer. He said, "Come back Thursday." Not to play. I said, "I know." He said, "You lost $40,000 tonight." I said, "I paid $40,000 tonight." There was a difference. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone revising a category they had placed someone in, and above his shoulder the King of Spades pulsed once, large and dark, and I held the pulse in my memory the way I held all data I did not yet have a framework for. I left the room at 2 in the morning and walked to where I had left my bicycle 3 blocks away and stood beside it for a moment in the cold. $40,000 was a significant portion of the flour container. It was also the most expensive and most accurate piece of information I had purchased since coming back. Felix Han had a mechanism I could not locate. He knew about my movements before I entered his room. He had a King of Spades above his shoulder that occupied perceptual space in a way no other card had ever occupied it. And he had looked at me at the end of a hand I had lost and said, "Come back Thursday," with the tone of someone who had been waiting for me specifically. I got on the bicycle and started home, and the cold was sharp and exact, and somewhere above the financial district the King of Spades was the largest card in my perceptual universe, and I did not know yet what that meant, but I knew it meant something I had not encountered before in either life, and not encountered before was both the most dangerous category and the only one that had ever been worth $40,000. My sister's light was on when I got home. She was awake at 2 in the morning, which was unusual, and I stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment before I looked. Then I looked. The 7 of hearts above her shoulder was the same card it had always been. Warm. Steady. Continuous. I let out a breath I had not known I was holding and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and sat at the table and thought about Thursday. Thursday came with rain, and the financial district looked different in the rain, less deliberate, the expensive surfaces wet and ordinary, the kind of weather that leveled architecture. I arrived at the address at 9 p.m., 2 hours before the time Han had specified, because arriving early to a meeting that someone else had called was the first signal, and the first signal mattered more than most people understood. The door was answered by the same dealer from Sunday, who looked at me without surprise and said, "Mr. Han is expecting you," and led me through the clubroom, which was empty at this hour, and up a staircase in the back that I had not seen on Sunday to a room on the second floor that was not a poker room. It was an office. Books on 3 walls, a desk that was used rather than decorative, 2 chairs across from each other near the window with no desk between them. Han was in one of the chairs with a cup of coffee, and he gestured at the other chair, and I sat in it and looked at him directly and waited. He said, "How long do you remember?" I said, "Everything." He said, "From birth?" I said, "From a few months before I could speak." He looked at me steadily. He said, "In the previous life you were a poker player." I said, "World champion." He said, "I know." I said, "Then you also know how I died." He said, "Shot. Single round, rear entry, during the invitational final." I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you know who?" I said, "That is why I am here." He picked up his coffee and held it without drinking it and said, "Before I tell you what I know, I need to tell you what I am, because what I am is the context without which what I know will not make sense to you." He told me about the deck. Not everything. Enough. 52 people, globally distributed, each carrying a title corresponding to a playing card, each one a person who had died, come back, and retained full memory of the previous life. The organization had existed for longer than any of its current members could verify. The oldest member Han had met claimed 4 consecutive lives of memory, each one building on the last, and even she did not know when the deck had been founded or by whom. What she knew, and what Han knew, and what he was now telling me, was the structure. The 52 operated as a network of control across casino infrastructure, financial institutions, corporate holdings, and in 3 cases direct political influence. Each member held their card as a title and a designation of territory and function. Han was the King of Spades. He had been the King of Spades for 11 years, since the previous holder had retired to a private island and relinquished the title through a process he described as complicated and which I understood to mean contested. I listened without interrupting. In the previous life I had learned that the most valuable thing you could do when someone was telling you something important was to let them tell it completely rather than redirecting it toward the questions you already had, because the questions you already had were defined by what you already knew and the point of listening was to find out what you did not know yet. When he finished I said, "Where do I fit?" He said, "You don't yet." I said, "Then why tell me?" He said, "Because 3 weeks ago a woman named Sue came to me with information that concerned you specifically, and information that concerns you specifically concerns me because I have been watching your movement through the district for 8 months and I have not seen anything that moves like you move in 11 years of watching this district." I said, "What information?" He said, "Sue is the Queen of Hearts. She has been inside the deck for 6 years and she has been trying to dismantle it from inside for 4 of those 6 years. She came to me because she believes the person who killed you in your previous life was not someone she can reach from inside the structure. She believes you can." I sat with this for a moment. The office was quiet except for the rain against the window and the specific silence of a room where something significant had just been laid on the table without being dressed as anything other than what it was. I said, "She wants to use me." He said, "She wants to give you something you want in exchange for something she wants, which is structurally different from using you, though the practical experience may feel similar." I said, "What does she want to give me?" He said, "The internal map of the deck. Every member, every territory, every institutional connection, every weakness she has documented in 4 years of operating inside it." I said, "And what does she want from me?" He said, "She wants you to take the deck apart card by card from the outside while she continues working from the inside, and she wants you to do it through poker because poker is the mechanism the deck uses to resolve disputes internally and it is the one arena where an external player can engage a member on terms the organization has to recognize as legitimate." I looked at the King of Spades above his shoulder. It was doing the thing it had done on Sunday, occupying more perceptual space than any card I had ever seen, and I understood now that the size was not about the scale of his fate. It was about the scale of what was attached to his fate, 51 other cards, 51 other people, a structure that had been running for longer than any of its members could verify, and somewhere inside that structure the person or thing that had been present at my death. I said, "Why are you telling me this instead of her?" He said, "Because she does not know I know about her. I found out 3 months ago and I have not acted on it because what she is trying to do is the same thing I have been trying to do for 11 years from inside. And 2 people trying to do the same thing from different directions are more effective than one, and the only way to make that true without either of them knowing about the other was to find the third person who would connect them." He looked at me steadily. He said, "You are the third person." I said, "You are the King of Spades. If I am going to take the deck apart card by card, I will have to take you eventually." He said, "Yes." I said, "And you are telling me this anyway." He said, "When the time comes for you to come for me I will play you clean and you will either win or you will not, and if you win you will deserve whatever comes with it, and if you do not then the question will resolve itself." He said it without drama, in the tone of someone who had thought about it long enough that the thinking was finished and what remained was simply the fact. I had met 3 people in 2 lives who spoke about their own defeat with that quality of calm and all 3 of them had been the most dangerous people I had ever encountered. I said, "When do I meet Sue?" He said, "Tomorrow morning." He gave me an address, a tea house in the Eastern Residential District, 7 a.m., asked for the back table. He said she would already know I was coming because she monitored his movements and his monitoring of others as a matter of operational practice. I said, "She will know you told me about her." He said, "Yes." I said, "That is a significant thing to give away." He said, it is the price of the arrangement. Some prices are worth paying. I left the office and went down the back staircase and through the empty clubroom and out into the rain and stood on the wet pavement for a moment thinking about the word arrangement and about what it meant that the King of Spades had spent 11 years trying to dismantle an organization he led and had not managed it and believed I could do what he could not. The rain was steady and cold and I was $20,000 ahead of where I had been before the $40,000 loss on Sunday because Han had returned half my buy-in through the dealer as I left, folded in an envelope with no note, which was itself a communication more precise than a note would have been. I got my bicycle and started riding east and thought about the internal map of the deck, 52 members, 52 territories, 52 weaknesses documented over 4 years by a woman who had been living inside the structure she was trying to destroy. In the previous life I had built my operation from nothing over 10 years. With a complete map of the opposition I could move faster than that. Significantly faster. The question was what Sue's map actually contained versus what Han believed it contained. And that question would begin resolving itself at 7 a.m. in a tea house I had not been to. I was passing the apartment building where my parents lived when I saw the car. Black, parked across from the entrance, engine off, no visible occupant but the specific quality of stillness that occupied vehicles had rather than empty ones. I had learned to read parked cars in the previous life when someone had tried 3 times to surveil my operation before the 4th attempt which had not been surveillance. I did not stop riding. I noted the plate number by looking at it the way you looked at things you were not looking at and I rode past without changing pace and turned at the next corner and stopped. I sat on my bicycle in the rain and thought about the car and about Sunday's meeting and about the message I had sent 4 words through a bartender and about how many people in the Dex network would have noticed an unknown external player moving through the district for 9 months and winning at 14 clubs. The answer was, enough. The answer was, this was faster than I had expected and I had been expecting it to be fast. I rode home through the back entrance and went upstairs and checked my sister's door. Half open. She was asleep, arm off the edge of the bed. Above her right shoulder the 7 of hearts was warm and steady and continuous and I looked at it for 3 full seconds before I let myself believe it and went to bed. In the morning I was going to meet the Queen of Hearts and receive a map of an organization that had killed me once and did not yet know I was coming for it. The car across the street meant someone in that organization was already paying attention. Paying attention and knowing what to do with attention were different skills and I had not yet established which one I was dealing with. 7 a.m. would begin to tell me. Everything before 7 a.m. was preparation and preparation was the thing I did better than anything else in either life. I set the alarm for 5:30 and lay in the dark and above the city somewhere 51 cards were distributed across 51 people who did not know that the 52nd was already in motion. And somewhere among them was the answer to the black card and the answer to the shot from behind and the answer to every night I had fallen asleep reaching for something I had not been allowed to hold. The rain continued against the window. Steady, cold, indifferent to what it was falling on. I found that useful. Indifferent systems were the most reliable ones. They did not adjust for who you were. They simply continued. I was going to continue too. The tea house existed in the way certain places in eastern residential districts existed, not advertised, not concealed, simply present for the people who knew to look for it and invisible to everyone else. 7 a.m. in the front room had 4 occupied tables, morning regulars with the settled posture of people who came here because it was the same every day and the same every day was what they needed. I asked for the back table and the woman at the counter looked at me with the specific non-reaction of someone who had been asked for the back table before and led me through a doorway behind the counter into a smaller room with 2 tables, both empty except for one. She was perhaps 30, slight, with the quality of stillness that I had learned to distinguish from calm stillness that was actively maintained rather than naturally present, the stillness of someone who was always listening to more than one conversation simultaneously. Above her right shoulder floated a Queen of Hearts and it was the most complex card I had seen in 12 years of seeing them, not large like Han's King, not simple like the numbered cards of ordinary lives, but layered, as if the card contained depth that the surface did not show, as if looking at it directly produced a slightly different image than looking at it peripherally. I had never seen a card do that. I sat down across from her and she poured tea into a second cup without being asked and pushed it toward me and said, "He told you about me." Not a question. I said, "Last night." She said, "I know. I monitored his movement at 9 p.m. and the duration of the meeting and your exit." She said it without apology, as information rather than confession. I said, "Then you know what he told me." She said, "I know what he knows about me, which is less than the complete picture but more than I intended him to know, which means I have a gap in my operational security that I have not yet located, and locating it is now a secondary priority to this conversation. She spoke in the compressed way of someone who processed information faster than speech allowed and had made a permanent accommodation with that gap. I said, "What is the complete picture?" She said, "The complete picture is that I have been inside the deck for 6 years, I have been building the internal map for 4, and I have been waiting for a specific type of external actor for the last 2. She looked at me. She said, "You are not exactly what I was waiting for. You are younger and less established, and you have one confirmed loss in your district record that concerns me." I said, "The 40,000 was deliberate." She said, "I know that too. The concern is not the loss. The concern is what it revealed. You paid $40,000 for a read on Han and you still do not have a complete read on him." I said, "No." She said, "That means your ability has a ceiling." I said, "Everything has a ceiling." She said, "The question is where yours is relative to what you are going to need." She opened a flat case on the table and removed a document, not digital, physical, printed on paper that had the weight of something that had been handled many times, and placed it between us without releasing it. She said, "This is 12 members. Not all 52. The 12 I have fully documented with enough operational detail to make each one vulnerable through a direct poker challenge under deck rules." She said, "The deck's internal dispute resolution mechanism requires any member to accept a formal challenge from another member or from a registered external player operating in their territory." She said, "Han registered you as an external player in his territory 3 days before Sunday's session." I said, "Without telling me." She said, "He needed the registration to be clean, which meant you could not know about it. The registration is what gives you legal standing under deck rules to challenge any member whose territory overlaps with his." I said, "How much of the district overlaps?" She said, 11 of the 12 documented members have territorial overlap with the King of Spades designation. She finally released the document and I picked it up and looked at the first page. Names, territories, institutional connections, and for each member a vulnerability profile, the specific weakness in their poker game that 4 years of observation had produced. I read 3 profiles in the time it took her to pour more tea. The profiles were precise in the way that only sustained close observation produced. This was not intelligence gathered from outside. This was intelligence gathered from sitting at the same table and watching and remembering for 4 years. I said, "You played against all of them." She said, "I am the Queen of Hearts. I have standing to play any member." I said, "And you lost deliberately to build the profiles." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I won when winning served the documentation. I lost when losing produced more information." I said, "How many times did you lose on purpose?" She said, 19. I said nothing for a moment because 19 deliberate losses was a particular kind of sustained discipline that I had encountered only once before in 2 lives, and it had been in myself, and encountering it in someone else was disorienting in the way that mirrors were sometimes disorienting. She said, "The first member I want you to challenge is the Jack of Clubs." She gave me a name, a man called Brennan, 38, who controlled the Northern District's casino licensing infrastructure through 3 shell companies and a direct relationship with 2 city planning officials. She said his vulnerability was specific. He played mathematically sound poker under normal conditions and fell apart under what she described as constructed chaos tables where the variance was artificially inflated through aggressive multi-way pots that made mathematical play unreliable. She said, "He knows the math and he trusts the math, and when the math stops working he does not have anything underneath it." I said, "Manufactured chaos is a specific table skill." She said, "You have it." I said, "How do you know?" She said, 9 months of watching you move through the district. The 2 clubs you did not play were both high-variance environments. You read the variance before you sat down and you avoided it. Avoiding it means you understand it. Understanding it means you can produce it. This was accurate, and the accuracy of it told me the quality of her observation, which was the quality I had hoped it was from the moment Han described the 4 years of documentation. I said, "When?" She said, "Brennan holds a monthly private game, invitation only, last Friday of the month. 3 weeks from now." She said, "I can get you an invitation through a second-degree connection that will not trace back to me." I said, "And after Brennan?" she said, after Brennan, the sequence matters. She turned to the second page of the document and walked me through the order: 11 members, specific sequencing based on the way territorial losses would cascade through the deck's internal power structure, each loss weakening the next member's position before I reached them. She had planned this the way you plan a demolition, not which wall to hit first but which wall's collapse would compromise the load-bearing capacity of every wall that came after it. I listened to the full sequence without interrupting. When she finished I said, "This is 4 years of work." She said, "Yes." I said, "And you were giving it to a 16-year-old you met 8 minutes ago." She looked at me with the expression of someone who had already had this argument with herself and was not interested in having it again. She said, "I am giving it to the person who sent 4 words to Felix Han and had him return half a buy-in with no note, which in 11 years of watching Han operate I have never seen him do for anyone." She said, "The age is a number. The buy-in return is data. I work with data." I took the document. I said, "What do you want when this is finished?" She said, "I want the structure dissolved. Not captured, not redirected, dissolved. Every institutional connection severed, every shell company unwound, every arrangement that gives the deck leverage over anything legitimate ended cleanly." I said, "And your own position?" She said, "I want to stop." I said, "From inside for 6 years." She said, "It is longer than it sounds." I believed her. 6 years inside a structure you were trying to destroy from within was a specific duration of sustained internal damage that I had seen produce a particular quality of tiredness in people, and she had that quality, carefully contained but present if you were looking for it, and I was always looking. I left the tea house at 8:15 with the document in my jacket and walked to my bicycle and stood for a moment in the morning light that had come after the rain, the district clean and specific in the way wet streets were specific after rain dried. I thought about 19 deliberate losses in 4 years of documentation and a sequence of 11 members mapped like a demolition plan. I thought about Brennan and the jack of clubs floating above a man who trusted math and had nothing underneath it. I thought about 3 weeks and what 3 weeks of preparation looked like when the opponent's complete vulnerability profile was already known. Then the first problem arrived. I was 3 blocks from the tea house when I turned a corner and stopped. The black car from last night was parked on this street. Different position, same plate. Which meant either the surveillance was on me specifically and had followed me from the apartment, or the surveillance was on the tea house and I had walked into it from the other direction, and both of those possibilities had a third possibility underneath them, that someone in the deck already knew about Sue, about the map, about the 4 years of documentation, and the car was not surveillance but something that came after surveillance when surveillance had already produced its answer. I did not stop walking. I passed the car at normal pace and looked at the driver's side window at the angle that showed me the interior without showing that I was looking, and the car was empty. Which was its own kind of information. An empty surveillance vehicle either meant the operator was on foot nearby or meant the vehicle had been placed and was not currently active. Neither option was comfortable and neither option permitted the kind of response that would have been satisfying. The response that was available was to ride home, put the document somewhere other than the flower container, and spend the next 3 weeks becoming the kind of problem for the jack of clubs that made everything else secondary. I got on the bicycle. Above the city the Queen of Hearts was layered and complex in my memory, and somewhere 3 weeks away Brennan was running his mathematical models with nothing underneath them, and I was going to be the chaos he did not have a model for. The document was in my jacket against my chest. Sue had spent 4 years building it. I was going to spend 3 weeks learning it well enough that I could burn the physical copy and carry the contents the way I carried everything that mattered, which was in the part of the mind that did not forget, that had not forgotten a single hand or a single tell or a single moment of the previous life, that had come back intact through whatever process returns things that are not finished yet. At home my sister was eating breakfast and the 7 of hearts above her was warm and steady, and she said, "You look like you were out all night," and I said, "I went for an early ride," and she said, "In the rain," and I said, "Yes," and she looked at me with the expression she had been developing since she was 12 of knowing when I was not telling her something and choosing not to press it, and I sat down across from her and she pushed the bread toward me without being asked and I ate and looked at her. Carden thought about Sue saying "I want to stop" and about what 6 years inside something that needed destroying cost a person, and about the fact that the 7 of hearts was warm and I was going to keep it that way regardless of what the next 11 members cost. I said, "How is school?" She said, "Boring." I said, "Good." She looked at me. She said, "Good?" I said, "Boring means nothing is wrong." She thought about this for a moment and said, "That is a very strange way to think about school." I said, "It is a very practical way to think about school." She shook her head and went back to her breakfast, and I finished mine and went to my room and opened the document to page 1 and started reading Brennan's vulnerability profile again from the beginning, this time memorizing it rather than understanding it, because understanding it was already done and what remained was the work. The game that broke Brennan took 4 hours and 20 minutes and I was bored for the first 90 of them. Not performing boredom, genuinely, productively bored in the way that a system running below capacity was bored, the way a machine built for heavy load felt when the load was light. Brennan played exactly as Seuss' profile described, tight, mathematical, position-aware, the kind of player who made no large errors and accumulated small edges over long sessions with the patient efficiency of someone who had converted poker into accounting. Above his left shoulder a jack of clubs floated with the particular quality of face cards, not the dimensional weight of hands king, but solid, purposeful, a card that knew what it was doing. I watched it for the first 20 minutes and then I stopped watching it because the card was not the information I needed. The information I needed was already in the document I had memorized over 3 weeks, and what remained was execution. The invitation had arrived 11 days after the tea house meeting through a contact Sue had described as second degree, a man who ran a legitimate card room 2 districts east and who owed Brennan a favor that he was now spending on my entry. The invitation was for the last Friday of the month, private game, Brennan's club in the Northern District, 8 players, buy-in of 30,000. I had the 30,000 from the flower container plus the return 20 from Han, and I had spent the 3 weeks between the invitation and the game not practicing poker. I did not need to practice poker, but practicing the specific table environment that Seuss' profile said would destroy Brennan's mathematical foundation. Constructed chaos. Multi-way pots with artificially inflated variance. The conditions under which clean mathematical play became actively misleading rather than reliable. The other 6 players at the table were Brennan's regulars. I had identified 4 of them from Seuss documentation, peripheral figures in the deck's Northern District operations, the kind of players who attended these games as a function of their professional relationship with Brennan rather than as independent poker entities. They played to his rhythm. The table had the quality of a room organized around one person's preferences, which meant disrupting those preferences would disrupt everyone simultaneously, which was an advantage I had not fully anticipated until I sat down and felt the room's dependence on its center of gravity. I disrupted it on hand 12. Not the biggest hand of the session, a medium pot, 4-way action, the kind of hand that ordinarily resolved itself through standard position play. I played it wrong by every mathematical standard Brennan operated on. I called from out of position with a speculative hand, I raised at a pot size that made no mathematical sense, and I showed the bluff when I took it down, which was the specific move that the mathematical mind found most destabilizing. Not losing to a bluff, seeing that someone at the table was willing to operate completely outside the mathematical framework and was prepared to reveal that openly. Brennan's breathing changed. I had not expected to tell this early. Seuss' profile said he was controlled under normal conditions and I had not yet produced abnormal conditions, only the beginning of them. But the breathing changed and once a tell started it was mine. I filed it and played the next 4 hands conservatively, returning to standard play, giving him 20 minutes of mathematical normalcy in which to recalibrate and convince himself the bluff was an anomaly. Then I disrupted hand 17 the same way from a different angle. He called when he should have folded. He lost a significant pot to a hand he would have correctly folded against 3 weeks ago, before he had watched me show a bluff and then play straightforwardly for 20 minutes. His model of me was corrupted, and corrupted models were the most dangerous thing a mathematical player could carry because they applied the wrong framework with the same confidence as the right one. By hand 23 the table had changed its quality. The regulars were adjusting their play in response to mine rather than in response to Brennan's, which meant the center of gravity had moved, which meant the room was mine in the practical sense of the word even if the chips had not yet reflected it. Brennan knew this. I could see him knowing it in the specific way I could see things that other people at the table could not see, in the micro-adjustment of his posture, in the almost imperceptible change in the timing of his decisions, in the way the jack of clubs above his shoulder had lost the solid purposefulness it had carried at the start of the session and was now doing something I had not seen a face card do before, flickering slightly, as if the card was uncertain about what it was describing. The hand that ended it was hand 31. By this point I had accumulated enough chips to be the second largest stack at the table and Brennan was still the largest, his mathematical approach having produced its usual steady accumulation in the hands I had not disrupted. The pot built over 4 streets in a way that was partly my construction and partly the natural consequence of a table that had been destabilized enough that 3 players were making decisions they would not have made 2 hours earlier. By the river it was heads up, Brennan and me, with a pot that represented a significant portion of both our stacks. He had a strong hand. I knew this not from his cards, I could not see his cards, but from the reconstruction of the entire hand through the lens of his behavior at each decision point. His breathing pattern, the timing of his bets, the angle of his attention, the almost imperceptible forward lean he produced when he was confident about his holding. All of it said strong hand. All of it said he was about to bet large and expected a fold or a losing call. All of it was exactly what it appeared to be. I raised all in. The mathematical correct response to an all-in against a strong hand when you have been watching the razor play chaotically for 3 hours was to call. Brennan's model said I was a chaos agent who had been running a bluff-heavy strategy all night. His model said the all-in was another bluff from a player who had demonstrated willingness to bluff large. His model was correct about my strategy and completely wrong about this specific hand because I had the nuts, the best possible hand given the board, and I had spent 3 hours building exactly the model he now held so that when I held the nuts he would read them as a bluff. He called. I turned over the hand. He looked at the board and then at my cards and then at the board again with the expression of someone whose mathematical framework had just produced an outcome it should not have been able to produce. Not a bad beat, a structural failure. His model had been right about my chaos strategy and the model's accuracy had been the mechanism of his defeat. I had used his own competence against him. I stacked the chips. The room was very quiet. The regulars had the quality of people recalculating everything they thought they had understood about the last 4 hours. Brennan sat with his cards face down in front of him and did not speak for a long moment, and the jack of clubs above his shoulder had stopped flickering and gone still in a way that was different from its opening stillness, a way that suggested not purpose but conclusion. He said, "You are the external player hand registered." I said, "Yes." He said, "This was a formal challenge under deck rules." I said, "It was." He said, "You should have announced it before the game started." I said, "The rules require notification within the session, not prior to it." He looked at me. He said, "You know the rules." I said, "I read them carefully." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want?" I said, "The Northern District licensing infrastructure. The 3 shell companies and the planning relationships." I said, "Transferred cleanly, documented through proper registry channels, completed within 30 days. He looked at his chips, my chips now, on the table and said, "And if I refuse the transfer?" I said, "Then we discuss it with Han in his capacity as King of Spades, who registered this challenge and is therefore the adjudicating authority on its outcome under deck rules, and I suspect you do not want that conversation." He did not want that conversation. I could see he did not want it in the way I could see most things about people across a table, which was completely and without effort. He said, "Done." He said it the way people said things when they had finished calculating and found no exit. I said, 30 days. He nodded. I cashed out and left. Outside the Northern District was cold and the streets had the specific quality of Friday night in an area where the legitimate businesses had closed and the illegitimate ones were beginning their operational peak. I stood on the pavement and felt the completion of the first move in Sue's 11-member sequence and thought about what it meant arithmetically. 1 down. The Northern licensing infrastructure removed from the deck's operational base. 10 remaining. The sequence she had mapped said the second member, the 10 of diamonds, a woman who controlled 3 legitimate casino licenses through a holding company, would already be feeling the loss of Brennan's position within 48 hours because their territorial arrangements were interlocked in a way that made one's loss the other's vulnerability. I sent a message to Sue through the channel we had established after the tea house meeting, a specific pattern of purchases at a market stall she monitored that communicated status updates without requiring direct contact. The pattern said, "First position complete." She would know what it meant. She would update her internal documentation and prepare the next profile, and the machine would continue turning. On the way home I passed the apartment building and looked for the black car. It was not on the street. It had not been there since the 3rd day after the tea house meeting, which was either reassurance or a change in surveillance methodology, and I had learned in the previous life that the absence of visible surveillance was not the same as the absence of surveillance. I had been careful. I was going to continue being careful. Careful was not the same as afraid, and I had not been afraid since the tea house morning, not because there was nothing to fear but because fear was not a tool that produced useful output, and I had stopped carrying tools that did not produce useful output somewhere around the second month in the previous life. My sister was awake when I got home. Sitting at the kitchen table with a book, which was her usual midnight activity on weekends, and she looked up when I came in and said, "You smell like a poker room." I said, "I was in a poker room." She said, "I thought you stopped doing that." I said, "I started again." She looked at me for a moment with the expression she had been developing since she was 12 and said, "Are you going to tell me what is actually happening?" I said, "Eventually." She said, "That is not the same as yes." I said, "No, it is not." She went back to her book with the specific quality of not pressing the point that was one of the things I valued most about her. The understanding that some information arrived when it arrived and demanding it earlier produced a worse version. Above her right shoulder the 7 of Hearts was warm and steady. I looked at it for 3 seconds the way I always looked at it and let the warmth of it register as data rather than as comfort, because data was reliable and comfort was a state that changed without warning, and I did not build on things that changed without warning. I went to bed and thought about 10 remaining in 30 days for Brennan's transfer and the 10 of Diamonds, already feeling the structural shift, and Sue somewhere across the city updating her documentation in the specific quiet of someone who had been waiting 4 years for the machine to start moving. I thought about Han knowing about Sue and not acting on it, and the King of Spades filling the perceptual space above his shoulder with its dimensional weight. I thought about the black car and its absence. I thought about the black card, the one without suit or number, and where it sat in the hierarchy of the deck structure, above all 52, or outside all 52, or in a category the deck structure did not contain. Sue's map had 11 members. Han had said 52 total. The 41 she had not documented were not in the first sequence, but they were not absent. They were the walls behind the walls, and I had learned in the lower gallery of the previous life's work that the walls behind the walls were always the ones that mattered most. 11 was the beginning. The beginning was enough for now. The beginning was what you worked with when the beginning was what you had, and you worked it completely and without reservation, and then the next thing became visible, and you worked that too. I closed my eyes. Somewhere across the Northern District Brennan was sitting with the conclusion of the Jack of Clubs and the 30-day clock I had started, and somewhere east of him the 10 of Diamonds was beginning to feel a structural instability she had not yet identified the source of, and the source was me, and the source was moving. The 10 of Diamonds was named Reyes, and she was 41 years old, and she had built her position in the deck not through poker brilliance but through institutional patience. The kind of operator who moved through legitimate licensing structures the way water moved through existing channels, finding the path that was already open and widening it incrementally over years until the channel was hers. Above her right shoulder the 10 of Diamonds was precise and even, a card that communicated exactly what it was, no depth, no flicker, no ambiguity, 10 units of something arranged symmetrically, and symmetry in a card was the tell I had learned to read as a specific operational style, someone who maintained balance as a primary objective rather than as a tool, someone for whom equilibrium was not strategic but constitutive. People like that had one reliable weakness. Disrupt the equilibrium on two sides simultaneously, and they could not process both disruptions at once, and in the moment of choosing which side to address, the other side took the foundation. Sue's profile said Reyes played poker the same way she operated, institutionally balanced, conservative, the kind of player who made her money in marginal situations where her opponent's range was wider than hers and the math consistently favored her narrow construction. She had won 3 of the last 4 internal deck challenges against her, not by dominating but by surviving while her opponents made the errors that accumulated margins produced. The vulnerability was specific: she could not play from behind. When her stack fell below 60% of its starting size, she began making the calibrated conservative decisions that had made her successful, and those decisions were wrong in a deficit situation because they were designed for a game where she held the structural advantage. She had never learned to play without the structural advantage because she had never needed to. 4 years of Sue's observation confirmed she had never been more than 18% below her starting stack in any session she had participated in. The solution was to get her there in the first 40 minutes. The access was more complicated than Brennan. Reyes did not hold a monthly game with external invitations. She played in 3 rotating venues, all within the legitimate casino infrastructure she controlled, and the games were by existing relationship only, no second-degree access, no invitation chain. I spent 8 days after Brennan mapping the venues and the player rotation and the one structural gap in the relationship requirement, which was a provision in deck rules that Sue had flagged in the document and which I had memorized as a contingency. Any registered external player in territorial overlap with a deck member could request a direct table session if they could demonstrate active engagement in that member's operational territory. The Northern District licensing infrastructure was now mine through Brennan's transfer. The licensing territory overlapped with 2 of Reyes's 3 venues. I was operating in her territory by definition, and the request for direct engagement was procedurally valid. I filed the request through Han. This was the second time I had used his position as King of Spades as the mechanism for a challenge, and the second use was different from the first because the first had been established procedure and the second was a signal to Han, to Sue who monitored Han, and to anyone else in the deck who was watching the registered external player in the King of Spades territory take apart the deck's northern operations sequentially. The signal was deliberate. Sue's sequence was designed to move faster than the deck could respond institutionally. An institutional response required information, and information required time, and every time I made the process procedurally clean I added friction to their response time because procedurally clean challenges were harder to counter than irregular ones. Han forwarded the request without comment. Reyes responded in 48 hours with a venue and a time and a buy-in of 45,000, which was 15,000 above the standard for a direct engagement and was itself a communication. She knew what was coming and she was trying to make the entry cost prohibitive. I had 80,000 in the flower container. I confirmed the buy-in and the date and spent the remaining 12 days before the session running the specific scenario Sue's profile described, getting an opponent's stack below 60% in the first 40 minutes until the execution was automatic. The venue was a room inside one of Reyes's licensed casinos, separated from the main floor, 6 players including the 2 of us. Her 4 regulars were more sophisticated than Brennan's had been, not peripheral deck figures but active participants, people who had played with Reyes long enough to reinforce her structural advantage rather than merely orbit it. They knew her game. They played to support it. The room had a quality of coordinated operation that Brennan's had not, and coordinated operation was a specific challenge because disrupting one element disrupted them all in ways that were not always predictable. I disrupted Reyes's stack to 63% of starting in the first 31 minutes. Not through one large hand but through 4 consecutive medium ones, each slightly below the threshold that would have triggered her full defensive response, each one extracting a portion of her stack without creating the kind of dramatic moment that would have forced her into conscious recalibration. By the time the cumulative effect was visible, she was already in the zone Sue's profile identified as her functional failure state, and she was making the conservative calibrated decisions that had made her successful in games where she held the advantage, and those decisions were producing losses because the conservative play in a deficit position fed the pot odds of the remaining players in ways that compounded against her. Hand 19 was the structural break. It was a 3-way pot, me, Reyes, and one of her regulars, and the texture of the board was exactly the kind of balanced, symmetric construction that suited her natural game, and she played it exactly as her natural game dictated, and that was the error because I had constructed the pre-flop action specifically to make the balanced symmetric board texture misleading. She bet the turn for value with a holding that was strong in isolation and weak in the context of the range I had represented across the previous 18 hands. Her regular folded. I raised. She called. The river changed nothing material. She bet again, smaller this time, the micro-adjustment of someone who had begun to register doubt but could not yet locate its source. I raised all in. She tanked for 4 minutes. I did not watch her face during the 4 minutes because watching the face was the amateur read and I was not an amateur. I watched the 10 of diamonds above her right shoulder, which had been doing its precise symmetric thing all evening and was now for the first time showing the micro-asymmetry that face cards showed when the decision underneath them was genuinely uncertain. When the asymmetry appeared in a card, it meant the person had no reliable process for the current decision. No reliable process meant the next action would be determined by something other than analysis. Something other than analysis in a high-pressure moment defaulted to whatever pattern the person had used most frequently in their life. Reyes's most frequent pattern was conservation. She called. I had the better hand. Not the nuts this time. I had run the math before the river raise and my equity was 73%, not 100, and 27% of outcomes would have gone differently. The card that came was in my 73. I had made the play because the 73% was correct given the structure of the hand and the session and the sequence I was running, and correct plays made consistently over time produced correct outcomes at the rate the math specified, and I had made more correct plays in 2 lives than I could count, and the math had always specified correctly in the end. Reyes lost the pot. Her stack was now at 31% of starting. The 10 of diamonds above her shoulder had returned to its symmetry, but the symmetry was different now, tighter, the kind of equilibrium that was being actively held rather than naturally present. She played the next 6 hands with the quality of someone managing a position rather than competing from one, and managing a position was not the same as competing, and everyone at the table felt the difference, including her regulars, who began adjusting their play toward me rather than toward her, and by hand 27 the room's center of gravity had moved in the same way it had moved at Brennan's table, and for the same reason. I took the session cleanly. When the chips were counted and Reyes had lost her stake and I had gained it, and the room had the specific silence that followed sessions where something more than money had changed hands, she looked at me across the table and said, "You planned this from before you filed the request?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You have Brennan's territory already?" I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you want from mine?" I told her, the 3 casino licenses, the holding company transfer, the institutional relationships cleaned and re-registered. I told her the same 30-day window. She looked at her empty chip position and at the card I had produced as identification when I filed the formal challenge, an external player registration card with hand seal on it, which was a physical object she had procedural standing to honor even if she objected to its implications, and she said, "This is accelerating faster than anyone in the structure anticipated." I said, "That is the design." She said, "Who designed it?" I said, "I did." This was partially true. Sue had designed the sequence. I had designed the pace. The pace was mine. Outside it was early evening and I rode back through the district thinking about the 30-day clock for Brennan's transfer, which now had 16 days remaining, and the new 30-day clock for Reyes, which started tonight, and Sue's sequence, which had 9 members remaining after these first 2. I passed through the eastern residential district and thought about the tea house and Sue's layered complex queen and what 6 years of sustained internal damage looked like on a person who had learned to contain it and carry it as information rather than weight. I thought about what I had said, "I did it," and about the partial truth in it, and about Sue receiving the market signal that said second position complete. My sister was at practice. I had the apartment to myself, which was a specific quality of time that I used for things that required the absence of other people, not because I was hiding the things but because the things required a silence that cohabitation disrupted. I sat at the table and updated the internal version of Sue's document, not the physical copy which I had burned on day 4 after memorizing it, but the version I carried, which was more detailed than the original because I had been adding to it through direct observation over the weeks since the tea house. Each member I encountered produced information that updated the profile of every subsequent member in the sequence, because the deck was a network and network members shared information patterns and operational habits the way people in any organization shared the culture of the organization without intending to. 9 remaining. The third in sequence was the 8 of spades, a man called Vero who controlled the district's private chip exchange, the mechanism through which poker winnings were converted into legitimate financial instruments inside the deck's network. Sue's profile said he was the most technically skilled poker player in the 11-member sequence and the one most likely to identify and counter the chaos strategy before it produced results. She had flagged him with a single additional note at the bottom of his profile that said, "Do not underestimate the gap between his capability and his habits." The note was the kind of note that said more by being brief than it would have said by being long. I thought about the gap between capability and habits. In the previous life I had played against 3 people who had that gap, people who could have beaten me if they had played at the level their capability permitted but who defaulted to the level their habits had established. 2 of them I had beaten easily. The third had almost beaten me before I found the specific pressure point at which capability and habit diverged and applied it precisely enough to cause the divergence in the middle of the hand that mattered most. Finding the pressure point was the work. The work was what I did. The apartment was quiet and the flower container had more money in it than it had ever had, and somewhere in the network 9 cards were waiting to be played. I started on Vero's profile. The gap between capability and habits required a different preparation than chaos strategy or equilibrium disruption. It required identifying the exact condition under which a skilled player stopped playing skillfully and started playing habitually. Sue's 4 years said the condition for Vero was specific. He played at full capability against opponents he respected and defaulted to habit against opponents he had assessed as inferior. The assessment happened in the first 15 minutes of a session. The 15 minutes were the whole game. If he assessed me as inferior in the first 15 minutes, I could run his habits against his capability for the rest of the session. If he assessed me correctly, I would be playing the most technically skilled opponent in the sequence without the structural advantage that chaos or equilibrium disruption provided. The solution was in the 15 minutes, and the 15 minutes were a performance, and I had performed precisely and deliberately at a poker table since I was 9 years old in the previous life, and the performance was the one skill that translated across lives without modification because it was not a poker skill. It was an older skill. It was the skill of being seen as exactly what you chose to be seen as, no more and no less, for exactly as long as the choice served the purpose and not one moment longer. I practiced it in the quiet of the apartment until my sister came home from practice, and then I stopped and we had dinner and she talked about school and I listened, and the 7 of hearts was warm above her right shoulder and the evening was ordinary in all the ways the evening needed to be ordinary, which was most of the ways that mattered. Vero took 15 minutes to assess me as inferior and I spent 14 of them helping him do it. The performance was specific. I arrived at the 8 of spades table, a private room inside the chip exchange facility he operated in the Western District, invitation obtained through the same procedural challenge mechanism as Reyes, filed through Han, accepted in 36 hours, and I played the first 14 minutes like someone who had learned poker from books rather than from 10,000 hours of live competition across 2 lives. Not badly enough to be obvious. Badly in the specific calibrated way that sophisticated players recognized as the signature of a technically informed but experientially shallow game: correct folds in simple spots, slightly wrong sizings in complex ones, the micro-hesitations of someone consulting an internal decision tree rather than reading a table in real time. Above his left shoulder the 8 of spades was compact and dark, a card with the quality of compressed force, the kind of card that did not announce itself but was present in a way that other cards were not. I watched it peripherally for the first 10 minutes and then I stopped watching it and committed to the performance because the performance required complete attention and partial attention to anything else would have degraded it. On minute 14 Vero made a bet sizing that was 2.5 times larger than the pot required to achieve his objective, and the excess size was the tell, not a bluff tell, not a fear tell, but the specific sizing pattern of a player who had decided his opponent was inferior and was now playing to extract maximum value from that inferiority rather than to play correctly. He had assessed me. The assessment was complete. He was now playing his habits against what he believed I was, and what he believed I was had been constructed by 14 minutes of deliberate performance and had no relationship to what I actually was. I let him run the habits for 8 more hands. Not passively, I played those 8 hands correctly from my position, which meant playing in ways that were consistent with the inferior player he had assessed while quietly extracting information about the specific texture of his habitual game. His habits were good. Sue's profile had said technically skilled and the habits reflected it: tight ranges, sound construction, the kind of poker that was correct 80% of the time and merely adequate the remaining 20%. The 20% was where the gap lived. The gap between capability and habit was always visible in the 20%, the situations that fell outside the habitual patterns coverage, and in Vero's game the 20% was multi-street bluff catching. He could identify a bluff intellectually. He could not call it emotionally when the bet sizing crossed a threshold his habits had established as danger. The threshold was 3/4 pot on the river after a check raise on the turn. Every time that specific sequence appeared in his history, Sue's documentation showed a fold rate of 91% regardless of pot odds. I built the sequence on hand 23. It took 3 streets of careful construction, pre-flop, flop, and turn all calibrated to produce the precise board texture and pot geometry that would make the river 3/4 pot bet after a turn check raise both correct by equity and triggering by habit. The construction was the most technically complex thing I had done at a table in either life. Not because the individual decisions were difficult, each one in isolation was straightforward, but because maintaining the inferior player presentation while executing technically precise multi-street constructions simultaneously required 2 separate operational tracks running in parallel without interference. The inferior presentation for Vero's conscious assessment. The technical construction for the hand's objective. 2 tracks, no interference, 23 hands of sustained execution. The turn check raise produced the response Sue's profile predicted. He called with the hesitation of someone whose habit said fold and whose capability said his hand was strong enough to continue, and the capability won the turn decision because the pot was not yet at the threshold. I had counted on this. The capability winning the turn was necessary for the river to work. If he folded the turn, the construction collapsed. He called. The river came and I checked. He bet medium size, the bet of someone who had decided the check meant weakness and was now extracting value. I check raised to exactly 3/4 of the pot. The threshold. He sat with the decision for 6 minutes. I had not tanked for longer than 90 seconds in any hand in either life, and 6 minutes told me the conflict between capability and habit was operating exactly as Seuss' profile specified. Capability said the pot odds were sufficient for a call. Habit said the sequence was danger. 6 minutes said neither one was winning cleanly. The card above his shoulder had done something I had not seen the 8 of spades do at any point in this session. It had tilted, very slightly, the kind of tilt that was not visible unless you were looking for it. And I was looking for it because I had been looking for the specific signals that cards produced when their holders were at genuine decision points since I was a child in this life and had spent 10 years looking in the previous one. He folded. I showed the bluff. Not immediately, I let the moment sit for 3 full seconds before I turned the cards, which was the specific timing that maximized the informational impact. The bluff itself was the secondary point. The primary point was the demonstration that the inferior player he had assessed in the first 14 minutes did not exist, had never existed, and that everything he had built his last 23 hands of decisions on was a construction I had made and he had accepted. The demonstration was not for satisfaction. It was operational. A player who has been shown that his assessment process failed responds in one of two ways: he recalibrates completely and becomes more dangerous, or he overcorrects and becomes predictably aggressive. Seuss' profile said Vero overcorrected. The profile said that in 4 years of observation she had seen him shown up twice, once in an internal deck game by a member who had since left, and both times his response was the same: immediate escalation, larger bets, broader ranges, the overcorrection of someone whose competence-based self-image had been challenged and who responded to challenge by increasing the signals of competence rather than the competence itself. The next 6 hands confirmed it. He played the way Seuss' profile said he would play after the demonstration: bigger, wider, louder in the ways that poker was loud, and each escalation fed the pot structure I was building because aggressive escalation from a skilled player created the exact variance environment that I had used against Brennan 6 weeks earlier, the chaos I could navigate that mathematical and habitual players could not. He was creating my best environment while trying to create his. The irony was architectural. I could not tell him. I let it run. The session ended with me holding 68% of the chips in play. Vero had lost his stake in 2 rebuys. When the counting was finished and the room had the quality it always had when something more than a poker session had concluded, he looked at me across the table and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "The first 14 minutes." I said, "Yes." He said, "The whole time." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why show the bluff?" I said, "Because the bluff was not the point." He understood this. I could see he understood it in the way the 8 of spades above his shoulder settled back into its compact dark stillness, not the purposeful stillness of the session's opening but the settled stillness of something that had reached its conclusion and was no longer in motion. I told him what I wanted. The chip exchange operation, the conversion infrastructure, the institutional relationships that allowed poker winnings to enter the legitimate financial system through his mechanism. 30 days, clean transfer, documented through proper registry channels. He said, "You are dismantling the deck's financial circulatory system." I said, "The exchange is one component of it." He said, "It is the most critical component. Without clean conversion, the territorial winnings have no path to institutional utility." I said, "I know." He said, "Whoever told you to start with the exchange infrastructure understood the network at a level most external actors do not." I said, "The sequence is mine." He said, "No, it is not." He said it flatly, without aggression, as a statement of operational analysis rather than accusation. He said, "No external actor builds this sequence without internal documentation." I said nothing. He looked at me for a moment and said, "The Queen of Hearts." Not a question. I said nothing. He said, "She has been building that map for 4 years and 3 months. I said, "I cannot speak to that." He said, "You do not have to. The sequence speaks to it." He looked at me. He said, "Tell her that Vero says she is better than they know she is. Tell her that from me." I cashed out and left. On the street outside the chip exchange facility, I stopped and thought about what he had said and about the specific quality of a person who has just lost a significant position to an opponent and responds by sending a compliment to the person who built the weapon that defeated him. It was the response of someone with a particular relationship to the truth, someone who valued accurate assessment over comfortable narrative even when the accurate assessment was costly to them. It was the same relationship I had. I filed Vero's message and rode east toward the market stall that served as my communication channel to Sue and completed the purchase pattern that said, "Third position complete, additional information attached, contact when able." She responded through the channel that evening. The response was a single item at the market stall, a specific product placed at a specific position that our established code translated as received, proceeding, and one word that we had not assigned to a product in our original code construction. She had added it in the second week of our arrangement, a new signal for a new category of information. The word was careful. I rode home thinking about careful and about what careful meant from a woman who had been inside the deck for 6 years and had survived it through a combination of operational discipline and the specific courage of someone who had chosen a long game over a safe one. Careful from Sue was not general caution. It was specific warning. The question was what had changed in the 3 weeks since I had last received anything but status acknowledgments through the channel, and the answer to that question was not available through the market stall code. The answer required direct contact, and direct contact carried risk, and the risk calculation was Sue's to make because she was inside and I was outside, and the inside perspective on risk was the one that mattered in this case. I waited. Waiting was a skill I had developed in the previous life through necessity and had arrived at in this life through choice, which made it a cleaner skill in this life, not the waiting of someone with no other option but the waiting of someone who understood that information gathered under pressure was less reliable than information gathered in the natural time of its emergence. 3 days. On the third day she came to the market herself. Not through the stall code, physically, in person, which broke protocol in a way that told me the careful signal had not been general and had not been for something the code could carry. She was wearing the specific quality of unremarkable that people wore when they were actively not being seen, and she was not being seen very well, better than most people I had encountered but not as well as someone who was operating at full capacity. There was something beneath the unremarkable that was different from our tea house meeting. At the tea house she had been contained. Now the containment was active, which meant whatever she was containing was larger than usual. I bought something at the stall next to hers and moved to a position where we were adjacent without facing each other and said, "What?" She said, quietly and without looking at me, "They know about the sequence." I said, "Vero identified it." She said, "Vero is not the problem." I said, "Then who?" She said, "The 7. I said, "Which suit?" She said, "All 4 of them." She said, "The 4 7s operate as a subcommittee inside the deck structure that functions outside the normal territorial hierarchy and handles internal security. They have been watching the sequence since Reyes." She said, "They are not going to challenge you at a table." I said, "Then what?" She said, "They have identified your sister." The market was bright and ordinary around us, and people were moving through it with the specific purposefulness of people doing ordinary things on an ordinary morning, and I stood next to a market stall and processed what Sue had just said and let the processing complete before I responded, because responding before processing was complete was the one operational error I could not afford to make when the information was this specific and this structural. I said, "How long have they known about her?" Sue said, 4 days. I said, "What do they know?" She said, "That she exists, that she lives with you, that she is the only person you have consistent contact with outside your operational activities." She said, "They do not know about the 7 of hearts." I said, "You know about the 7 of hearts?" She said, "I know about all of them." I said, "How?" She said, "I see them too." She said it quietly, without elaboration, and I looked at her for the first time since we had been standing adjacent, and the Queen of Hearts above her right shoulder was more layered than I had ever seen it, depth behind depth behind depth, and I understood that the 6 years inside the deck had been possible because of the cards, and that the cards were the reason she had known I was the right external actor before she had proposed the arrangement to Han, and that there were things about the organization of people who could see cards that neither Han nor Sue had told me yet, and this was not the moment to ask about them. I said, "What do I do about my sister?" Sue said, "Move her." Not obviously, not a sudden relocation that signals awareness of the surveillance. A natural movement. A reason that exists independently. I said, I can create a reason. She said, you have 2 days before the surveillance on her becomes something other than surveillance. I said, I understand. She said, I am sorry. I said, do not be. I said, this is the cost of the sequence moving at pace and the pace is correct. She looked at me. She said, you sound very certain about the pace. I said, I am certain about the pace. She said, the 4/7s have not been activated against an external actor in 11 years. The last time they were activated, the external actor did not complete the sequence. I said, how many members did he reach before he stopped? She said, 3. I said, I have 3. I said, the difference is I know about the 7s before they have moved. She said, the difference is also that you have a sister and he did not. She left through the market's eastern exit and I bought 2 things at the nearest stall and left through the western one and rode home at a pace that was 3% faster than my normal pace, which was fast enough to close 2 days of timeline into one if needed and slow enough not to signal urgency to anyone who might be monitoring movement patterns in this district. My sister was at the kitchen table when I arrived. Above her right shoulder the 7 of hearts was warm and continuous and I looked at it for 1 second and then I sat down across from her and said, I need to tell you something. She put down what she was reading. She looked at me with the expression she had never fully needed until now. I said, there are people paying attention to me who I do not want paying attention to you. I said, I need you to go stay with Aunt Mira for a few weeks. Not as emergency, I am going to tell her it is because I am doing renovation work on the apartment, which is a reason that holds. She said, is this about the poker? I said, it is about what the poker is part of. She was quiet for a moment. The 7 of hearts was steady and warm and I let the steadiness of it register and I did not look away from her. She said, are you in danger? I said, I am managing the situation. She said, that is not the same as no. I said, no it is not. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, when do I need to go? I said, tomorrow morning. I said it without apology because apology implied that keeping her safe was a cost I was uncertain about paying and I was not uncertain. She nodded. She said, okay. She said it with the specific quality she had always had of understanding that some information arrived with its decision already made and the response that served everyone was acceptance rather than renegotiation. That night I sat in the apartment after she had packed and gone to sleep and I thought about the 4/7s and the 11-year interval and the external actor who had stopped at 3. I thought about 8 remaining after Varro and the sequence Sue had built and the pace I had set in the 2 days before surveillance became something other than surveillance. I thought about Varro saying tell her she is better than they know she is and about Sue's layered queen and about careful and about what the 4/7s operating outside the territorial hierarchy actually meant for the sequence's remaining members. I thought about the black card, which had not appeared in any documentation and had not come up in any of my 3 sessions and which remained the organizing question underneath every other question, not the deck, not the sequence, not even the shot from behind, but the black card and what it described and whose shoulder it floated above. I got up and went to the window and looked at the street. No black car. The absence of the black car was either reassurance or a change in method and I had been deciding for 6 weeks that it was a change in method and proceeding on that assumption. Tomorrow my sister would leave for Aunt Myra's and I would have the apartment to myself and the sequence had 8 members remaining and the 4/7s had been activated and the pace was correct and the pace was mine and I was going to continue at the pace regardless of what came next because stopping was not an option that the previous life's ending had left available to me. The street was quiet. The district around me was running its Friday night operations with its usual efficiency, the legitimate and illegitimate layers of it proceeding in parallel as they always proceeded, neither fully aware of the other, both dependent on the other's existence. I was moving through both layers simultaneously in the way that only people who understood both layers could move, and I had understood both layers since the age of 8 in this life and had spent 10 years mastering the understanding in the previous one, and the understanding was the reason I was still in motion while the external actor who had reached 3 members 11 years ago was not. 8 remaining. The 4/7s. The black card somewhere above a shoulder I had not yet identified. The morning would come and my sister would go to Aunt Myra's and I would start the preparation for the 4th position in the sequence, a man called Park, the 9 of clubs, who controlled the district's tournament scheduling infrastructure and whose vulnerability profile Sue had marked with a note that said, the most personal of the 11, handle accordingly. The most personal of the 11. I had been thinking about that note since I memorized it, and I had not yet understood what personal meant in this context, and understanding it was the work of the next preparation period, and the preparation period started now, and the window was dark and the street was quiet, and somewhere in the city the 4/7s had begun to move, and I was going to be faster. Park was the most personal of the 11 because Park had been at the table when I died. Not as the shooter. Sue's profile was precise about this, and I had read the precision with the specific quality of attention I reserved for information that reorganized existing structure, not shock, because the previous life had trained the shock response out of me over 10 years, but the clean realignment of a framework that had been operating on incomplete data. Park had been the 9 of clubs for 14 years. He had been at the invitational final as the tournament director, which was his function before the deck elevated him to full membership, and his position at the table gave him sightlines that no player had: full visibility of the room, knowledge of the security arrangement, access to the schedule that determined when the break would occur and where each player would be during it. He had not fired the shot. He had made the shot possible. The distinction was one I had been carrying since the tea house morning when I first read his profile, and I had been carrying it the way I carried things that required sustained processing, not in the foreground where they affected current function, but in the background where the processing continued without consuming the operational bandwidth I needed for the sequence. Personal did not mean emotional. It meant I needed to understand what I was sitting across from before I sat across from it, because sitting across from someone who had enabled your death without processing that fully was the kind of incomplete preparation that produced incomplete performance, and incomplete performance in the fourth position of a sequence that had activated the 4/7s was not something the sequence could absorb. I spent 5 days on the processing. Not analysis, the analysis was complete, but something older and less nameable that the previous life had required of me 3 times and that this life was requiring of me now for the first time. The specific interior work of bringing the full weight of a fact into operational contact with the self that would have to act on it, without the weight distorting the action. My sister was at Aunt Myra's. The apartment was quiet. I used the quiet. On the 6th day I filed the challenge through Han. Park's territory, tournament scheduling, the infrastructure that determined which clubs hosted which events, who received invitations to which invitationals, and the power that came from controlling access to high-stakes competitive environments overlapped with the northern and western districts I had taken through Brennan and Vero. The procedural standing was clean. Han forwarded the challenge without comment as he had forwarded the previous ones, and I wondered on the 7th day, waiting for Park's response, whether Han knew about Park and the invitational final and the sightlines from the tournament director position. Whether any of what Han had told me in his office about being the third person had been constructed around the knowledge that the fourth position in any logical sequence would be Park and that Park was the one with direct connection to my death. The response came on the 8th day. Not an acceptance. A counter-proposal. Park wanted the game at a neutral venue, not one of his clubs, not one of mine, but a location he named that I did not immediately recognize. I ran the address through what I knew of the district's geography and identified it as a building in the central commercial zone with no listed casino registration, which meant either the location was unlicensed or it was licensed under a category I had not yet mapped. I accepted. Neutral venue was a tell the player who insisted on neutral ground was either afraid of home table disadvantage, which skilled players were not, or was managing something about the venue that had nothing to do with poker. The something was information and I was going to collect it. The 9 of clubs above his left shoulder was the first thing I registered when I walked into the neutral venue's back room and saw Park for the first time. It was not what I expected. I had constructed a mental image of the card over 5 days of processing, and the image had been tight and purposeful, the card of someone who operated with deliberate function. The actual 9 of clubs was diffuse, the pips scattered across the card's face in a pattern that communicated something I had not encountered in any card I had read in 12 years of reading them, not uncertainty, not conclusion, but the specific quality of a person who had been waiting for something for a very long time and was no longer sure the waiting was going to produce the thing they had been waiting for. It was the card of sustained anticipation turned to exhaustion. It was the most unexpectedly human card I had seen in the sequence. Park himself was 53, compact, with the careful physical economy of someone who had spent decades in rooms where how you moved communicated as much as what you said. He looked at me when I came in with an expression I could not immediately categorize, which was rare enough that I noted it specifically. Not assessment. Not hostility. Not the professional neutrality of a man who had accepted a formal challenge and was preparing to defend his position. Something that had more history in it than any of those expressions, and history in an expression usually meant recognition, and recognition usually meant the person knew more about me than the challenge documentation contained. There were 4 other players at the table. I identify 2 of them from Sue's peripheral documentation, not deck members but regular participants in Park's tournament circuit, the kind of players whose presence provided cover for a game that needed to look like an ordinary high-stakes session rather than a formal deck challenge. The setup told me the neutral venue was not neutral in the way I had initially understood. It was controlled Park's people, Park's environment, the appearance of neutrality over a structure that served Park's operational needs. Which meant the counter-proposal had not been about home table disadvantage. It had been about controlling the witness profile. I sat down. Park said nothing. We played the first 6 hands in the specific silence of 2 people who both understood that the session was not primarily about the hands. His poker was different from the previous 3, not mathematical like Brennan, not balanced like Reyes, not technically constructed like Vero. It was intuitive, the game of someone who had spent years reading players rather than reading boards, who understood people at tables the way I understood people at tables, through the accumulation of everything they communicated without intending to. He was the first opponent in the sequence who was playing the same game I was playing. Not the card game. The other one. The reading. On hand 7 he said, without looking up from his cards, you play like someone who has done this before. I said, everyone at this level has done this before. He said, I mean before this life. He said it in the tone of someone releasing something they had been holding for a specific length of time. I looked at him. He said, I knew the previous one. Not well. As a tournament director knows a world champion, the professional knowledge, the observation that came with the function. He said, I recognized you the moment you walked in. Not the face. The way you walk into a room. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said, you know what I am here for. He said, I know what the challenge documentation says you are here for. He said, I also know you read profiles before you play, and whoever wrote your profile on me included the invitational final. I said, yes. He said, then you know my position at the table and what it allowed. I said, yes. He said, and you are sitting across from me anyway. I said, I have been processing the fact of your position for 5 days. He looked at me. He said, and? I said, and I am here to play poker and take your tournament infrastructure through procedurally valid challenge. I said, what you did or did not do 14 years ago is a separate accounting, and I know the difference between a poker challenge and an accounting. He was quiet for a long moment. Above his shoulder the 9 of clubs was doing its diffuse exhausted thing, and I let the reading of it complete without acting on it prematurely, because premature action on incomplete card reading had cost me twice in this life and I had learned both times. Then he said, the black card. He said it quietly and the room did not change around us, but something in the architecture of the session changed, the way a room's acoustic quality changed when a frequency was added that had been absent. He said, you have seen it. I said, once. He said, whose shoulder? I said, I don't know. He said, I do. He said, I have known for 11 years, and it is the reason I have stayed in the deck when I would otherwise have left, and it is the reason I arranged the challenge response the way I did, and it is the reason this room has the witness profile it has and not a different one. I said, tell me. He said, after the hand. He picked up his cards. He said, play the hand first. And we will settle both accountings at the same time. We played the hand. It was the longest hand of the session, and in the execution of it I understood why Sue had marked Park's profile as most personal and why the marker had been specifically personal rather than difficult or dangerous. The hand required me to play against someone who read players the way I read players and who had information I needed that he was willing to give me conditional on the outcome of the poker, and playing against someone under those conditions was not like playing against a mathematical model or a balanced system or a habitual pattern. It was like playing against a mirror that was also a door, and the door only opened one way, and the way it opened was determined by who won. I won. Not easily. Not through the constructed mechanisms I had used against the previous 3, no performance, no chaos, no manufactured threshold. I won through direct head-to-head reading under full pressure with full information parity, and I won by one decision on the river that was not the mathematically optimal decision but was the correct decision given everything I could read about Park in the moment it was made, and correct and optimal were not always the same thing, and knowing when they diverged was the skill that had made me world champion in the previous life and was making me whatever I was becoming in this one. He looked at his cards after I turned mine. He nodded once. He said, "The black card is above the left shoulder of a man called Kane." He said, "Kane is not a member of the deck. He is the reason the deck exists." He said, "The 52 did not build the organization. Kane built the organization around people like us because people like us were useful to what he was building and he needed the structure to hold us in productive arrangement." He said, "Kane has been alive for longer than any member of the deck can verify." He said, "I do not know what the black card means. I know what it communicates." He said, "It communicates that Kane is not playing the same game we are playing." He said, "He is playing a longer game than any of us have the consecutive life experience to understand." I sat with this. The room was quiet and the four peripheral players had the quality of people who were present but not participating in what was actually occurring at the table, which was either professional discretion or instructions from Park to be present but non-participatory, and either way it served the current moment. I said, "Where is Kane?" Park said, "Everywhere the deck operates." He said, "Kane does not have a territory. He has presence." He said, "You have not seen him yet because you have been moving through the territorial layer of the structure." He said, "The territorial layer and Kane are connected but they are not the same thing." He said, "You cannot reach Kane through the sequence." I said, "I know." I said, "The sequence is not for Kane. The sequence is removing the structure around Kane." He looked at me. He said, "You understand the architecture of this." I said, "Sue understands the architecture. I am executing it." He said, "And when the structure is removed?" I said, "Then Kane is visible." He said, "And then?" I said, "And then I find out what the black card means." He held my gaze for a moment and then he looked down at the table and said, "The tournament infrastructure is yours. 30 days, clean transfer, documented properly." He said it with the quality of someone completing an obligation they had decided to complete before the session began, which told me the session had been partly a test and I had passed the test, and the passing was what had produced the information about Kane rather than any leverage I held. I said, "Thank you for the information." He said, "It is not generosity." He said, "I have been waiting 11 years for someone to reach position 4 in a sequence aimed at the structure, and I am not going to withhold information from the first person who has managed it." He said, "The previous actor stopped at 3. I said, "I know." He said, "He stopped because he did not know about the 7s. I said, "I know about the 7s. He said, "Knowing about them and managing them are different preparations." I said, "I have 7 sessions remaining and approximately 60 days before the pace produces an institutional response I cannot handle through procedural challenge." He said, 60 days is correct." He said, "Use them." I left the neutral venue at 11 p.m. and stood on the street in the cold and thought about Kane and the black card and a game longer than consecutive life experience could understand, and about what it meant that the card had no suit and no number and had been the first thing I had seen in this life and was the last organizing question underneath everything. I thought about Park's 9 of clubs and its diffuse exhausted quality, and about 11 years of waiting for a position 4 player, and I thought about my sister at Aunt Myra's with her 7 of hearts, warm and continuous, and about the fact that warm and continuous was the thing I was protecting and the protection was the reason the pace was what the pace was and not slower. I sent the market signal to Sue, 4th position complete, critical information obtained, request direct contact at earliest opportunity. I rode home through the empty late-night district and thought about Kane and about the structure that existed to make people like us useful to a longer game, and about what a longer game than consecutive life experience could understand actually meant in operational terms. I thought about the black card floating above a shoulder I could now name if not yet locate, and about the 52 cards distributed across the city and the world and whatever architecture connected them to the man who had built the organization that held them. 7 remaining. The 4 7s still in motion. 60 days. The apartment was quiet when I arrived, and the quiet was different from the quiet that contained my sister's presence, and I noticed the difference and let it be what it was, not absence but interval, the specific temporary quality of a quiet that would end when the interval did, and intervals ended when the conditions that produced them were resolved, and the conditions were being resolved at the pace I had set, and the pace was correct, and I was going to hold it. I went to bed and thought about Cain until the thinking produced nothing new, and then I stopped thinking about Cain and started thinking about the fifth position in the sequence, the Seven of Hearts, which was the first of the 4 sevens in the Internal Security Subcommittee that Sue had warned me about, and which Sue's profile had marked not with a vulnerability but with a single line that read, "This one knows you are coming." The line had been the most specific thing in the document, and I had been saving it, and now it was next, and knowing was not the same as ready, and ready was not the same as sufficient, and sufficiency was what I was going to spend the next available hours building, in the quiet of the apartment, with the window dark and the district running its operations around me and 7 cards waiting somewhere in the structure for the external player that the position 4 meeting had just confirmed was not going to stop. The 7 of Hearts knew I was coming and had been preparing for 11 days by the time I filed the challenge, which meant the preparation gap between us was 11 days in her favor, and 11 days was a significant gap when the person using it understood what they were preparing for. Her name was Kin. She was 37, had been in the deck for 8 years, and had held the 7 of Hearts designation for 6 of them, which made her the second longest serving member of the Internal Security Subcommittee and by Sue's assessment the most operationally sophisticated of the 4 sevens. Above her right shoulder, I was constructing this from Sue's documentation because I had not yet seen her in person. The 7 of Hearts was described in the profile's margin in handwriting different from the main text, added later, in the specific compressed script Sue used when she was recording something she had observed rather than analyzed. Warm, she had written. Complex warm. The handwriting told me Sue had seen Kin's card and had thought about what it communicated and had not been able to reduce it to the profile's analytic register and had written the observation as raw data instead. Complex warm from Sue, who wrote everything else in the profile as clean structural analysis, was the most significant notation in the entire 11-member document. I spent 3 days not preparing for Kin's poker game. I spent 3 days preparing for what complex warm meant in the context of a person who was the most operationally sophisticated member of the deck's internal security function and who had been given 11 days of advance notice of my approach. Complex warm was not a vulnerability. It was a character description, and character descriptions in operational documentation existed to prevent the operator from misreading the target, and the misread Sue was preventing was specific: do not read Kin as an adversary in the standard sense. The complexity of the warmth meant the warmth was real and the operational function was real, and both coexisted without contradiction, which was the profile of a person who was genuinely dangerous in a way that simple adversaries were not, because simple adversaries were manageable through the mechanisms that worked on simple adversaries, and what worked on Kin was not yet clear. On the 4th day I stopped not preparing and started preparing differently. I went back through everything I knew about the Internal Security Subcommittee's function, the 4 sevens operating outside territorial hierarchy, activated against external actors who threatened the deck's structural integrity, 11-year interval since the last activation, the previous external actor stopped at 3. I went back through Park's information about Cain and the longer game and the structure built to hold people like us in productive arrangement, and I thought about what internal security meant in an organization built by someone running a game longer than consecutive life experience could understand. Internal security in that context was not about protecting territory or institutional connections. It was about protecting the continuity of the game itself. The 4 sevens were not defending the deck's assets. They were defending the deck's existence as a functional structure. Kin's preparation for my arrival was not about winning a poker challenge. It was about determining whether I was a threat to the structure's continuity or a component of it. This reorganized everything. I filed the challenge on day 4 through Han, who forwarded it within 2 hours, which was faster than his previous forwarding times, and the faster time was itself a communication. Han was accelerating his participation in the sequence, and acceleration meant he had received information that changed his timing calculation, and the most likely source of that information was Park, who had told me about Cain at the neutral venue and who had 11 years of investment in a position 4 player completing the sequence, and who would have contacted Han after our session to communicate the status. The network was alive, and my moves through it were producing secondary movements I could not directly observe but could infer through the response times and the specific quality of the responses. Kin accepted the challenge in 4 hours. The response included a venue, her choice, which the rules permitted when the challenged party was a member of the internal security function, and a format specification that was not standard. She wanted a heads-up session rather than a multiplayer game. One opponent, extended session, no time limit. The format specification was the most significant piece of information in the acceptance document. Heads-up extended sessions were the format in which the reading game was purest, no peripheral players to manage, no table dynamics to construct or disrupt, just two people across from each other for as long as the session required, and the session required as long as the better reader needed. She was telling me she knew what I was, and she was proposing the environment where that quality would determine the outcome directly rather than through constructed mechanisms. I accepted. Not because I was certain I would win a heads-up reading contest against the most operationally sophisticated of the 4/7s with 11 days of preparation advantage. Because accepting was the correct signal. Refusing or counter-proposing a different format would have communicated that I was managing the matchup rather than engaging it, and managing from a registered external player was a different message than engaging. And the message I needed to send at position 5 was the engagement message, because Kin's evaluation of whether I was a threat to the structure or a component of it would be conducted through the poker, and the poker needed to show her what I actually was. The venue was a private room in a building I recognized from Seuss documentation as one of the 4/7's operational meeting locations, not a casino, not a club, a working space that served the subcommittee's function in the deck structure. Walking into it was a specific choice on Kin's part. She was conducting the challenge on internal security ground, which was either a statement of confidence or a deliberate provocation designed to produce a response she could read before the cards were dealt. I walked in without producing either confidence or provocation in my bearing, which was the third option and the correct one. She was already seated. The 7 of hearts above her right shoulder was the first thing I registered, and it was exactly what Seuss' compressed handwriting had not been able to fully capture, warm in a way that was structural rather than incidental, the warmth of a fire that had been burning long enough that you stopped noticing the heat and started noticing the light. Complex because the warmth coexisted with a precision that usually cooled warmth, the precision of someone who had spent 8 years doing what she did and had not let the doing of it harden her in the way that sustained operational function hardened most people. The coexistence was the complexity. It was the most unusual card I had seen in the sequence and possibly in either life. She said, "Sit down." I sat. She said, "I know about Park." I said, "I know you know." She said, "I know about Sue." I said, "I know you know that too." She said, "I have known about Sue for 2 years." I said nothing. She said, "I did not report it because what Sue is doing is correct, and I have known it was correct since the second year of my own tenure, and I have been waiting for the external actor who would make her documentation actionable." She said it in the tone of someone releasing a held breath that had been held for 2 years. I looked at her. I said, "You are one of the 4/7s." She said, "Yes." I said, "The subcommittee exists to protect the deck's structural continuity." She said, "The subcommittee exists because Kane built it to protect the deck's structural continuity." She said, "I am not Kane's instrument." She said, "I have not been Kane's instrument since the end of my second year." She looked at me steadily. She said, "I have been waiting inside the function the way Sue has been waiting inside the membership, and we have both been waiting for the same thing, and the same thing walked into this room 3 minutes ago." I processed this the way I processed everything that reorganized structure, completely, without showing the processing. I said, "The other 3 7s." She said, "The 7 of spades will not move against you if I do not." He defers to my operational assessment in activation decisions. She said, "The 7 of clubs will move regardless of my position." She said, "The 7 of diamonds is Kane's direct instrument and has been since his placement in the subcommittee 7 years ago." I said, "So 2 of the 4 are not threats in the immediate term." She said, "Correct." I said, "And you are proposing what exactly?" She said, "I am proposing that we play the session, you win it, and you take what the challenge documentation entitles you to take from my territory, and then you have procedural cover for my cooperation in the sequence's remaining positions without it appearing as cooperation." She said, "Your win is my protection. My protection allows me to give you what I have been building for 6 years alongside what Sue has been building." I said, "What have you been building?" She said, "The internal security documentation. Every protocol, every activation trigger, every communication channel, every response mechanism the 4/7s use." She said, "Without it you cannot reach positions 8 through 11 without triggering the 7 of clubs and the 7 of diamonds in ways the sequence cannot absorb." I looked at her. I said, why should I trust this? She said, you should not trust it independently. She said, verify it through Sue. She said, Sue has suspected my position for 14 months and has not been able to confirm it because I have not been able to make direct contact without compromising her cover. She said, after this session you will have the documentation and you will have a win over a 7 that will communicate to the deck's remaining structure that the sequence is inside the internal security layer, which will produce a response that you need to be prepared for and which the documentation will help you prepare for. She said, the poker is the mechanism. The poker has always been the mechanism. Play the hand. We played for 4 hours and 11 minutes. It was the cleanest heads-up session I had participated in across 2 lives, no constructed mechanisms, no performances, no manufactured thresholds. 2 readers reading each other across a table in an extended session with no time limit, both understanding what the session was and both playing it at the level it required. She was the best opponent I had faced in the sequence and possibly the best I had faced since the invitational final in the previous life. And the invitational final comparison was not casual. She had the quality of a player who had developed her reading through sustained contact with high-stakes reality rather than through practice, the same quality that World Championship level produced when the championship level was earned rather than inherited. I won by a margin that was smaller than any previous session in the sequence. Not because I was playing worse than the previous sessions but because she was playing better than any previous opponent. The winning decision was on the last hand of a long sequence of small decisions that accumulated into a structural advantage. I pressed at the correct moment, and the correct moment was identifiable only through the card above her shoulder. The 7 of Hearts had been doing its complex warm thing for 4 hours and in the final hand it shifted, not toward conclusion the way Brennan's Jack had shifted, but toward something I could only describe as release, the specific quality of a card above a person who had made a decision they had been postponing for a long time and had finally made it, and the making had produced relief. The release told me the moment was now. I pressed. She called and lost and the session was complete. She passed me a physical document across the table, not Sue's style of documentation, different in its architecture, more procedural, the specific structure of someone who had spent years inside an operational security function and knew how to document it from the inside. I took it. I said, the 7 of clubs. She said, his name is Mercer. She said, he will move within 10 days of this result reaching him. She said, the documentation contains his activation protocol, the specific sequence of steps he takes when he initiates action against an external actor. She said, you will see the steps coming before they arrive if you know what to look for. I said, and the 7 of diamonds. She said, the 7 of diamonds is a different problem. She said, he is Kane's instrument and Kane's instruments do not follow activation protocols. They follow Kane. I said, I will deal with that when it arrives. She said, it will arrive before position 11. I said, I know. She said, you are very calm about this. I said, calm is more useful than the alternative. She looked at me for a moment with the 7 of Hearts warm and released above her shoulder. She said, in the previous session, she meant the invitational final, 14 years ago in the previous life, the session that had ended with a shot from behind. She said, Park arranged the access. She said, but the person who commissioned it was not in the deck. I said, Kane. She said, yes. I said, why? She said, because you were going to win. She said, you were going to win the invitational final and winning it would have given you the platform and the resources to build the operation you have been building in this life, and you would have built it 14 years earlier. And whatever Kane is protecting in the longer game was not ready for that 14 years ago. She said, I do not know if it is ready now. She said, I do not know if that matters to you. I said, it does not change what I am doing. She said, I know. She said, that is the answer I was waiting for. I left the building at 2 in the morning with 2 documents, Sue's 11-member sequence material that I carried internally, and Kane's internal security documentation that I carried physically, and stood on the empty street and thought about Kane commissioning my death in the previous life because I was going to win, and winning would have accelerated a timeline he was not ready for. I thought about the longer game and the 52 cards and the structure built to hold people like us in productive arrangement, and I thought about what useful meant in the context of a game longer than consecutive life experience could understand. I thought about whether being useful to Kane's game and dismantling the structure he had built were compatible objectives or mutually exclusive ones, and the answer was not yet available, and the unavailability was acceptable because not yet available was a timing condition, and timing conditions resolved with time. I sent the market signal, 5th position complete, significant additional intelligence obtained, 2 documents in hand, Sue's direct contact required urgently. I rode home through the pre-dawn district and thought about Mercer and the 10-day window and the 7 of diamonds and Kane's instruments not following protocols. 6 remaining in the sequence plus Mercer coming and the 7 of diamonds arriving before position 11 in 60 days that were now closer to 45, and the apartment waiting with its specific quiet of a place where the person who usually occupied half the space was elsewhere for reasons that were the correct reasons and would resolve when the conditions resolved. My sister called at 7 in the morning. She said, "How is the renovation?" I said, "Progressing." She said, "Aunt Mira wants to know if you need a contractor recommendation." I said, "Tell her I have it handled." She said, "Are you sleeping?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You sound like you are not sleeping." I said, "I am sleeping enough." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The 7 of hearts thing." I stopped. She said it quietly, as if she had been holding it for a specific length of time. She said, "I have seen it since I was 4. Above my own shoulder in mirrors." She said, "I did not know if you could see it too, and I did not know how to ask." I said, "I can see it." I said, "I have been able to see it since you were born." She was quiet for a longer moment. Then she said, "Is that why you are doing what you are doing?" I thought about this. I said, "It is part of why." I said, "The rest of the why is older than this life." She said, "Okay." She said it with the specific quality she had always had of accepting information that reorganized the frame without requiring the reorganization to be comfortable. I said, "When this is finished, I will tell you everything." She said, "I will hold you to that." I said, "I know." She said, "Good." She hung up and I sat in the apartment with the specific warm quality of her voice and the recent air and thought about 4 years old and seeing a card above your own shoulder in a mirror and not knowing if the person across the table from you every morning could see it too and deciding not to ask for 12 years. The decision not to ask for 12 years was the most patient thing anyone had ever done for me in either life. I was going to make sure it was worth the patience. 6 positions remaining. Mercer in 10 days. The 7 of diamonds before position 11. Kane at the end of something that was not the sequence and was not yet visible but was becoming visible the way things became visible when the structure in front of them was removed piece by piece. I opened Kin's document and started reading Mercer's activation protocol from the beginning, because 10 days was enough time to prepare completely, and completely was the only preparation I made.